Welcome again to the Pharma Forum podcast. In this episode, I speak with Zach Powers, Chief Information Security Officer at Benchling, the R&D cloud platform for the biotech industry. From new tech stacks to data overload, as it were, Powers explains best practice around SaaS systems and the ins and outs and realities, as opposed to myths, of biotech security and privacy. With many efficiency gains yet to be seen, Powers believes the acceleration already evident will yet increase further if certain aspects, as here discussed, are straightened out. But the economy of data scaling must be the primary goal before then. As ever, thank you for listening. This is your host, Nicole Rowley, and today I have with me Zach Powers, Chief Information Security Officer at Benchling, the R&D cloud platform for the biotech industry. In this episode, we'll be discussing the latest when it comes to security and privacy within biotech. Biotech continues to innovate at speed, from autonomous therapeutic systems to CRISPR-based gene editing, from wearables to brain-computer interfaces, and from generative AI to quantum technology. Pace, acceleration, and importantly, precision are the name of the game. But so too are security and privacy. UK investment into the biotech industry and into cloud R&D is veritably booming. And unfortunately, as a result, the industry is becoming a lucrative target for cybercriminals. In fact, according to the Fortinet 2021 State of Pharmaceuticals and Cybersecurity report, almost all, or 98%, of pharmaceutical companies experienced at least one security intrusion. Therefore, as innovation continues in the biotech sector, security must evolve too, to protect crucial scientific data and manage the risks. But before we properly address this topic today, Zach, perhaps you could tell listeners a little bit more about yourself, your journey to now, your driving passions, and what you do in your role at Benchling.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, for having me. At Benchling, as you said, I serve as the Chief Information Security Officer, but I also oversee not just a large security organization, but I oversee our business technology organization as well. It's a more modern take on information technology. And what really brought me to Benchling is the opportunity to provide an impact to communities around the world. My wife is a scientist, surgeons and doctors in my family, so it seemed like quite a natural fit. But prior to Benchling, I was the Chief Information Security Officer and CIO of One Medical, the largest primary care provider in the United States. I took them from a small startup all the way through an IPO, but more importantly, took them from a time when healthcare records in the United States were still being faxed. They were still on paper, to having them fully digitized, and a lot of cooperation both with state, federal governments and universities on that front. And then if we go very far back in time, I was the Vice President of Enterprise Security at Salesforce, where we really helped pioneer what modern software security looks like, what modern cloud security looks like. And we used those innovations in security to advance how technology could be applied to communities around the world.
Thank you, Zach. So let's think about tech stacks to begin with, namely new tech stacks and what that looks like for biotechs. I mean, can you tell us why a new tech stack is particularly important in such an industry that deals with simply enormous amounts of data, processing, and automation?
Yeah, absolutely. And you really hit right at the core of it. It's how much data is being created. So most biotechs that I talk to throughout the world are struggling with the amount of data that's being created. For the average citizen out there, outside of biotech, outside of banking, outside of healthcare, it's hard to fathom how much data is being created. And the amount of data that's created this year, which is more than we've ever seen, will be far less than what's created next year. So the biotechs are starting to understand that to be able to compete, they need to change their tech stack to be able to handle not just gigabytes of data, not just manual actions with hundreds of workers and scientists, but terabytes of data and automated actions. So what we're seeing are a lot of biotechs begin to think about not just replacing a piece of software or a system, but in a complete tech stack overhaul. And they're doing that in order to be able to handle both the enormous amounts of data that are being created. They're doing that to become much more efficient. And they're doing that to address the modern security threats that you spoke of at the beginning of the podcast. So what you'll start to see as biotechs do invest in those modern tech stacks that are SaaS-based, that are large-scale databases, that are built ground up for scale, built ground up for security, you're going to start to see biotechs think about the traditional workflows in R&D, the traditional workflows in development, from an automation first, from a data-centric design first. And they'll get a lot of efficiencies. One biotech I was talking to in Europe recently was running 40 sequencing tests per month, doing it manually, and that grew them to the size they're at now. By overhauling their tech stack, they're now able to hit a couple 100,000 per year. So the scale is just tremendous, and that's why you're going to see biotechs doing it. If a biotech's running 10 or 20-year-old software systems that aren't interoperable, that don't talk to one another, that require manual care and feeding, if you will, they're going to start to struggle against the biotechs that have invested in a modern tech stack.
Thank you. Personally, that manual care and feeding makes me think of perhaps pets or livestock, but let's move on from that very traditional
well, there's that famous phrase, right?
Yes, absolutely. So let's think now of best practice. For example, how can biotech borrow from, say, banking or, as you mentioned, software as service and healthcare?
It's a very good question, because if we look at what's going on in biotech and say, what kind of challenges are biotechs facing today? And then we ask, have other industries faced similar challenges? The answer is yes. Banking was first out the gate to solve some of this. Healthcare followed thereafter. But those challenges were, if we go back in time, banking was struggling with the sheer amount of data involved in providing financial services and the complexity of that data. And how do you make sure you don't have data quality issues? How do you meet all of the regulatory requirements? And what the banks decided to do was come up with a common set of security protocols in order to share fundamental data with one another so that they could all get better together. And that is the basis today of why we can go to an ATM in one country or go to a bank in another country, and everyone has access to your data in a secure and private way. And they have the right amount of data. They don't have too much. They don't know everything about you. But that foundation took a while for the industry to come across. And what it allowed the industry to do is become much more efficient, hyper efficient in delivering services to their customers, delivering new products, but also gain some novel insight from studying that data. Healthcare did the same thing. So again, when I first joined One Medical, healthcare was not doing this yet. We had just started to talk about the same problems. So in the United States, a healthcare institution had its own data about its own patients. Another healthcare institution did not. So if you went to see a doctor in a different state, they knew nothing about you. Fast forward, it only took 4 or 5 years for the healthcare industry to come to terms with this and solve it, first through a common set of security protocols, and then through adopting modern tech stacks. So unlike banking, healthcare really had legacy tech stacks. And once healthcare started to adopt modern tech stacks, especially API-driven architectures, they were allowing themselves to transfer data at machine scale rather than faxing pieces of paper to one another. And so now in the United States, you can go to any doctor anywhere in the country, and generally they can pull up your healthcare information, and that is both secure and private. So those lessons and how they did that, leveraging software as a service and leveraging modern day security practices, allowed them to decentralize and share data. They still compete with one another. It's not that decentralization or sharing data kills competition. I've heard some biotech say, well, if I share my data, I can't compete. I don't believe that's the case. Those industries gained far more by working together than they did when they worked separately. And the way they did that was to adopt a common approach to technology foundations, modern tech stacks, modern security.
So, from these concepts of decentralization, data sharing, and advances through collaboration via new tech stacks, I want to get your opinion now in this area on AI. That perpetual, not just buzzword, not just notion, but a perpetual and evolving advanced technology tool. So, how can biotechs evaluate the security and privacy of AI tools? I mean, what cautions should businesses take when adopting enterprise grade AI tools? And what should a privacy and security due diligence framework look like?
It's a great question. There's a lot of talk about AI today and how it's absolutely brand new, and therefore we need a brand new approach in how we think about it. That's only partially true. The AI solutions being offered to companies are still software. So modern approaches to software security work just fine with AI. There's been a ton of publicly available research on the security of LLMs and generative AI. It is not the security risk that it is sometimes made out to be in the media. If a biotech evaluates both the technical security and the organizational security of the software company providing the AI solution to them, they're most likely to be able to find out very fast who can they trust and who they're not comfortable with. And when I advise a lot of companies about this, I said, look, just start with enterprise focused solutions first. The consumer AI solutions are not going to be built with security ground up, privacy ground up. They're not going to be built with a lot of protections around how your data is handled because they're meant for consumers. But if you look at enterprise offerings, they are going to be built ground up around how is a customer's data handled? What controls does the customer have around their data? And we recently, our head attorney for privacy, Audrey Kittock, and I just wrote a blog post on this where we step by step talk about what Benchling does to evaluate external AI solutions. But it really comes down to it's just software, running that software, and the company that makes it through standard supplier security software security analysis can evaluate whether you can trust them or not. And then there's the compliance side of things. Let's look at, do they have verifiable compliance posture? So do they have like a SOC 2 Type 2 or ISO 27001? Will they allow you to audit them? All of these aspects that we've come to know about, say, evaluating SaaS solutions are very applicable to evaluating modern AI solutions.
Thank you. So when we're thinking about these notions of trust and perhaps hesitancy, could you tell me a bit more about UK biotech industry's hesitancy to move from on-premises to the cloud? Maybe you could dispel some of the myths, particularly around cloud security and adoption in Europe versus the US, for example.
What I've seen in Europe, I spend a lot of time talking with companies in Europe, both biotechs as well as just general tech companies in Europe. There's a real hesitancy, and there has been in some industries, especially biotech, to adopt cloud computing or software as a service. There's hesitancy to adopt modern automations. Some of that comes out of the concerns around data residency of the past, where we believe that data needs to stay within borders and that you need to be able to see or touch a server. And there's a lot of security stories folks will tell from the past around why those restrictions were necessary. But in the modern world, what we're seeing is that data can actually be made more secure when it is in the cloud. A company can have more control and more certainty over how that data is handled when it's in the cloud. But in Europe, when I talk to biotechs, I'm often talking to companies who have never rolled out a SaaS solution in their company, or they only have 1, 2, or 3 SaaS solutions. It's not something they're quite used to. So how to meet security demands, how to meet regulatory demands is all quite foreign to them. And so what we often talk about is comparing and contrasting. As an example, at the beginning of the podcast, we're saying 98% of biotechs will face at least one intrusion, or did in the last year. What we often see is that companies with on-prem infrastructure, they are far more easily attacked. They have more intrusions and their data is less safe than companies that have that in the cloud. And part of this is just basic economics. If you look at a company like AWS, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on security. If you look at your average biotech, they cannot afford to spend the same amount on security. So there's an economy of scale with putting biotech data in the more secure place. Work with cloud providers like Benchling, who spend an exorbitant amount on security, rather than invest that yourself. And that's what I talk to a lot of biotechs in Europe about, but it's not as commonplace. So if I talk about application security or cloud security, I'm often having to talk through what those practices and procedures are, where if I was pitching this to a company on the West Coast of the United States, they have their own AppSec and CloudSec teams. So a lot of it's just an educational catch-up. Some of it, again, it involves some history between the United States and countries in Europe, but I believe we've moved past a lot of that history. And I do believe that European biotechs, European companies can really leverage the more modern approaches to cloud, more modern approaches to security for their own success. But there has to be this evolution in moving away from believing the physical control around a server is meaningful, because it's just not anymore.
Thank you. So this actually aptly preludes my final question, which is what next for biotech security and privacy, which perhaps begs the question, what next for biotech? I think I can guess where you're going to head with your answer, but tell us.
Yeah, there's this great intersection between what's evolving in security in the United States and Europe and parts of Asia as well, what's evolving with privacy, and then what's happening in biotech. And they are intersecting around developing new tech stacks. So you're going to see that happen across the board. You're going to see companies that need AI-ready data. So if a biotech company has a lot of legacy on-prem systems that don't interoperate well with one another, that can't handle massive data scale, they're going to have data quality issues. The data that they have is not ready for AI in the first place. So if they want to compete, they're going to change out their tech stack. And that new tech stack is going to be built ground up for scale. It's going to be built ground up for security, ground up for privacy, ground up for interoperability. And that's going to allow them to get AI-ready data sets. That's also going to allow them to drive AI into the actual scientist's workflow day to day. You'll hear a lot in biotech right now about novel drug discovery. And I know there's some drugs in the pipeline that were either AI assisted or AI discovered. But what I think we're going to hear a whole lot about is just the efficiency gains that generative AI provides a scientist if you embed AI into their workflows. Everything from summarization of data sets to report writing to basic analysis and initial actions. I think generative AI is going to speed up the work that scientists do. That will help get drugs and products to market faster, not just novel drug discovery. So I think that's coming. But for that to come, biotechs really will need to start embracing the economy of scale on security and privacy that SaaS solutions offer. Because biotechs are in the business to make discoveries, develop those, get those to market. They're not as much in the business to figure out security fully themselves or to figure out data scale fully themselves. They should be focused on their primary goal. And I think that's what you're going to see start to see happening here is a lot of biotechs are either going to fall behind and not compete, or they are going to change their tech stacks. They're going to embrace modern security techniques. A lot of the myths that we see will fall to the wayside. And just like we saw happen in healthcare or in banking, it'll become really a rising sea moment for all the biotechs that embrace that.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And so that concludes another episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find out more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments of the series at pharmaforum.com/podcasts. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, or X nowadays, at PharmaForum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.